Hi, I'm Romain. I'm a zoo and wildlife vet, and I'll be chatting to you about some of the crazy and really interesting things that we can do with wildlife as patients, as veterinarians. But more importantly, I'll be delving into why we do some of these things and question some of those underlying assumptions about what conservation is and what role we as veterinarians have in it. Sometimes as veterinarians we can get so focused on the technical aspects of what we need to do that we can lose sight of the bigger picture. We really need to think about why we end up doing what it is that we do as veterinarians. Even something as simple as what is actually a wild animal is not an easy question to answer in all cases. If we can't even exactly agree what a wild animal is, then it makes all those questions and difficulties around what is conservation and what should we as veterinarians be doing to aid conservation very difficult to answer. And should we even be focusing on the conservation and preservation of individual animal species when there is so little of our natural world actually left? Would it be better to forget about individual species and just focus on habitat preservation? With so much of the natural world destroyed, where do we draw the line with how we spend our very limited resources? Do we focus on species? Do we focus on subspecies like the Scottish wildcat here? Or do we have to aim for much broader concepts? And what role do zoos play in all of this? Are they truly bastions of conservation? Are they mainly important for the education of the public to what's going on in the natural world? Or do they have other roles to play?
It's Sunday night and we
just need to reiterate the quote from Bob Geldof years ago, which was, "Give us the bloody money."
yeah, okay, maybe okay, give us the bloody money. So, good evening, everyone. I forgot to turn on my microphone. Sorry about that. Welcome back to this new live episode and to this new webinar. We have, I'm Daniela Murgia. We are Vets4Ukraine2022, and as you might know by now, we are doing webinars for vets, for veterinary students, and for veterinary nurses to raise funds and help the British Red Cross to sustain the brothers and sisters in difficulties in Ukraine because of the war. And the good news here is that after now more than 2 months, or a little bit more than 2 months since we started our campaign, we have now raised, I think we are nearly at £13,200. And for this, I would like, not only me, but the group of Vets4Ukraine 2022, so all the specialists that have participated and will participate to this initiative, we would like to thank you and thanks the people that have donated and are following us and are so also coming in our lives and asking questions and following all the I would say excellent webinars that my colleagues are presenting. We are going live on different social media platforms. We are going live on Facebook, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. And until now, we have really assisted altogether to many interesting topics about any kind of veterinary medicine topic. So from surgery, soft tissue surgery, medicine, anesthesia. We have seen also, we have had an episode with Petra Akte about well-being. We have had here with us Elisabetta Mancinelli with an episode on the anesthesia in rabbits. So basically, any kind of interesting topics. And the speaker, before I introduce the speaker of today, I would like once again to ask you if you like us and if you find that our webinars are useful and interesting, I would like to invite you to donate and to support us in our campaign. And together with the donation, we would like to ask you to share the link of our webinars and also to talk about us with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family. We would like to reach as many people as possible. We would like to raise as many money as possible. We will be soon done with our webinars. So therefore, please help us in helping our friends and colleagues and brothers and sisters in Ukraine. You know, only a little help, or every little helps and counts. So please do donate and do what you can to help us. So the speaker of tonight is an exceptional and terrific speaker. As you can see here is ROMAIN PIZZI. ROMAIN PIZZI is a zoo and wildlife vet. And when I was now watching the introduction video, I was really, you know, I think I'm one of his most admirer, and I like ROMAIN a lot for what he does and the way he can communicate what he does and the passion that he's got for his job. So because ROMAIN is very busy and there are always, you know, things that happens in his life, and it was not easy to organize this live with him. So we have anticipated the episode and therefore we didn't have much chance to organize people to invite in the lives with us and to present him. Therefore, I must apologize, ROMAIN. You will have to be happy and satisfied with my introduction, with my presentation of yourself. So I would like to see whether ROMAIN here is with us. So, and if he is with us, so Paolo, could you please let ROMAIN come into the live with me? Hi, ROMAIN. How are you?
See me?
I see you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I apologize. I'm in a hotel room, which is not the best place to to be giving a webinar. And you don't need to apologize. It's my life that's chaotic. So I'm sorry I took so much chasing.
Where are you? Which part of the world are you?
So ironically, I'm in London. I'm in the Royal College of Physicians. They actually they have rooms. So I'm staying there tonight for some.
Hey, what have you done? What are you doing in London these days?
It's another talk I've got to give tomorrow. I'm not operating at the moment, but yeah, life is just as chaotic as ever. But thank you very much for inviting me to come and have a chat. I think for those that are maybe expecting traditional CPD, they will be disappointed. It really is a little bit of a chat. I know lots of people have said they're going to bring their children, so I've got to make sure that it's suitable and not too either gruesome or complicated, and there's something interesting. So perhaps it's just a little bit of a relaxing chat for those that are here, and you'll hear something interesting, and maybe it will stimulate your thoughts. But again, thank you very much for inviting me. The work that you're doing is amazing. I'm very impressed with Paolo, because I can barely work out my phone. I have to give it to my 11-year-old daughter, and he seems to be able to do all this amazing technical stuff. So if it all goes wrong, yeah, then I'm sure that he'll sort it.
So Romain, thank you for being here. We are honored to have you here, considering how busy you are. So thank you for finding the time to stay with us this evening. As I was saying, I just wanted to try to introduce you. So, but you can help me maybe. So, Romain Pizzi was born in South Africa. He's South African, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
And then he moved to the UK, where you did your internship and your residency. Do you want to
I got lost here, Daniela. It's quite complicated. It probably is a less salubrious story in that I had great expectations of being somewhere more exotic and ended up settling in Scotland by mistake, I would say. So I came to London, I did a master's, and then I went to Blackpool, of all places, to earn some money. And then I went to India. I was living in India, and I took a job in Scotland.
For how long have you lived in India?
It was less than a year. So I worked on the Vulture project there, and then I came back to take my residency, but I wasn't very impressed with the idea of a residency at that stage. So I think I took it as a job, stayed, passed my exams, and then 2 weeks before I left, I decided to date my now wife. And then I got offered a job in Russia for 3 years, and my mom got ill, and I had to make some decisions about life. And so I decided to stay and obviously look after family. And then I decided to get married. And then I kept thinking I would travel, but yeah, I've ended up being in Scotland for most of the last 2 decades by mistake, I would say.
By mistakes. So these are nice mistakes. So, Romain, I do struggle. I see some disturbed, so the line of the I cannot hear you very well. So
I've also got. I will try and speak up. It's not you. It's that I'm rubbish and I'm softly spoken. So if I flag off, you'll need to tell me, and I need to speak louder. If it doesn't work, I've got
Romain, are you there? Romain? Oh, there you are. Romain, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but very, very quickly. Did you send the form to the school for the picnic with the kids next Tuesday? It's just I'm on clinics. I can't go. But you said that you may be able to be free and go with the kids for the picnic. So if it's just to double check if you signed the form and sent it to the school or not. And I know you're in London just now. But on your way back to Edinburgh, do you think you could buy some bread? It's we're running out. That would be lovely. Thank you. Right. Jokes aside, I would like to introduce the speaker of this webinar, which is Romain Pizzi. So many of you will know Romain Pizzi for the work he's done with wildlife, with animals from zoos. He's work in conservation medicine, and the way he's pushed forward very ideas, like, for example, minimal invasive surgery that is really applicable to wildlife animal and also to zoo animals. And you may know Romain because he's this very creative person with this vision, really trying to help animals, help people, and very engaging with everyone. And what you may not know or may not be as familiar with is his other roles, like, for example, the husband and a dad. And that's why we started with this little joke. I just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that Romain is not just this amazing veterinarian, but he's also a really hardworking and a very good husband and an extremely good dad that manages to juggle all this overseas work, these travels, these crazy adventures with very day-to-day activities and life that might not sound as exciting, but they are very important for our children, and I guess for just his sanity, I guess. So I am sure you're going to be very, very well entertained by Romain's talk. And Romain, we are looking forward to having you back home. And if you can just bring some bread.
Bye. She's so lovely. You were not expecting this.
I'll pay you afterwards. I think I need to travel more and do more webinars for my wife to say such nice things. She's very kind. But I think jokes aside, that we often just focus on people's professional careers and forget that we're all people and we're dependent on the people around us. And particularly in my field, there's a very, very high rate of burnout. We know that there's huge problems in the veterinary profession. We're all overworked and understaffed, and many of the people I work with are particularly crazy. Many of the people care deeply about what they do, but with that comes the real risks of not looking after yourself. And if you don't look after yourself, you can't look after any of our patients. So it's very sweet what my wife has said. I think it's quite good that sometimes you will do an amazing operation, come back from the other side of the world, feel very proud of yourself, and then know that it's your day to clean the toilets. And I think that's a really good and healthy thing. And I'm probably not as good at cleaning the house as my wife, but I think I do try and do some of it, and it does keep things in balance, I think. So anyway, but I am lucky. None of what I would do would be possible without my family. So there is a slide towards the end with some pictures, and you'll understand how incredible my wife is. She's actually the one with the brains, and she just puts up with me being crazy and rushing around. So anyway, but listen, I'm quite boring. Let's talk about the animals. They're the interesting ones.
I just wanted to mention that I've seen one of the videos when you, with your two children, have you released two owls. I think it's on YouTube. That videos is amazing. Your children are so lucky. And Paolo can say, when I saw this short video recording that you did for us for the introduction, I just said, I want Romain to be my dad because I would like to follow you everywhere.
It sounds exciting. My kids are not impressed with me at all, because I don't play enough Lego and I don't have enough of the same interests as them. I guess the thing is, if you grow up, it's normal for you. So they have been pulled on weekends when Yolanda's been working or on call and I've had to go and see an emergency, and they've sat in a corner looking at videos on my phone while I've done operations or done post-mortems with them in backpacks and things. And it's never really been fun for them. So occasionally if a teacher thinks it's interesting or their friends think it's interesting, then they're interested for a few minutes. But I guess that's normal. I'd rather that they grew up like that, and then maybe when they're older, it'll all make sense to them. I'm not quite sure how much they understand about my work at the moment. I wrote a book. I was very proud that they started to read. They were going to read a little bit about it, but it's not a children's book, and it's quite, I would say it's quite boring for children. It is almost like it's almost like a textbook of what we can and do as wildlife vets across everything. So we'll do a little bit of that in the talk today, just for various people. But they did try, and we read little bits of it, but it's a bit of toil and it's not their interest. My son really enjoys playing Lego. My daughter enjoys different things. So we share bits, but
they are still very young. in the future they will appreciate what you do. So reading the title of your book, I automatically the mind went automatically to, not that I'm comparing you to him, but went automatically to James Herriot, and all the books that he wrote, and the one that was called All Creature Great and Small. And it is really like that, now that you are dealing with all possible kind of creature, which is to me is so fascinating. But now the surprise that we got for you, we have some new graduates that have sent videos with questions for you.
Okay.
Let's see. Are you happy? Are you happy to try to give them an answer?
Happy to embarrass myself, because the problem, as
Oh.
everyone knows, is there's so many animals and so many different problems. I'm sure I won't know half of it, but
Possibly.
we can have a go.
What was the animal that you told me you had to repair the leg? It was this giant rodent. How is the you said
Capybara.
Exactly. I was not even aware that it exists in the world, such an animal. So you see. So Paolo, have we got our new graduates with the questions for Romain?
Hello, I am Ilse. I am 6, 8. What is your favorite animal? Me is a dog. Bye.
Good evening, Dr. Pizzi. My name is Mattia and I'm 7-year-old. I would like to know how heavy a male lion is. Thank you.
Hello, I am Finn. I have a question for you. What is the weirdest animal you have ever treated? Bye.
Good evening, Dr. Pizzi. My name is Dante and I'm 10 years old and I go to 5th year primary school. And I would like to know how many species of sloth live in the forest.
Hello everyone, I'm Greta. I was born in England, but I'm Italian. My mum and dad are Italian. I'm in year 1 primary school. The dragons are there in zoos, and how many foods do they have to eat to be healthy and safe? How many cubs does a snow leopard have, and what's its favorite food?
Let me try and answer some of them. Some of them are really easy. Some of them are a little bit more difficult than they may at first appear. So I think probably the easiest one is a male lion. So I have quite a few lions that I look after, and I've got to go and do some more lions in Ethiopia and South Africa later in the year. So a large male lion, wild or in good condition in captivity, is approximately 200 kilograms. That's a good ballpark. But that differs. If they get a bit obese, they can go up to about 240 kilograms. And if they come from a desert region, then they tend to be much smaller. So if you see lions in, say, Namib Desert, some of the males will only reach about 120, 140 kilograms. So you will see the same with many animals that live in deserts. So bears that live in the deserts in China, the brown bears that live there are much smaller than the brown bears that we'll get in Europe. So hopefully that answers the question about how much lions weigh. Now, some of the others, a little bit more tricky. So the sloth question is a good one. So there's 6 species of sloth at the moment. They've got a variety of boring names, and I probably can't remember all of them, though I think my daughter can, because she likes sloths. But those 6 species of sloths, there's 4 species that are called 3-toed, and there's 2 species that are called 2-toed, and it depends on how many toes they've got in their front legs, because they've all got 3 toes at the back. But the reason that question is really interesting is that what makes a species? So we love to put animals into categories, and we decide that there's so many species of this, and there's so many species of that, and there's so many subspecies, and then it keeps changing because our understanding of animal changes. And so we forget that nature is not little boxes. And these animals have evolved over thousands or millions of years. And at some stage, we decide that there's enough differences that they're actually different subspecies or species. And so this has changed a lot over the years, in that the number of species of penguins constantly changes depending on what, if they think, say, the southern rockhopper and the northern rockhopper are actually different species, or if they're subspecies. And for example, the number of different tiger subspecies constantly changes. There were many subspecies of tiger, but now we've done some genetic work. We think that there may only be very few different subspecies, and then there's differences depending on where they live. And the reason these things are problematic, and they make my life difficult as a vet, and they make your life difficult if you work with a vet, is these things determine what we do. So we have to decide with the time that we've got how we work to save animals. So if we decided that it didn't matter what a subspecies was, then we just had to preserve some genetics for tigers. It's a much easier job. If we decided that every tiny little subspecies of tiger living in a different region is equally valuable, it's a lot more work, and there's a lot of challenges to protect some of them. Now, the Sumatran tigers living in Sumatra are in a lot more trouble than, say, tigers living in parts of Russia, which we'd call AMO tigers. But actually, are they really different, or are they the same sort of animal with some differences that they've developed where they live, and they're playing the same role in the ecosystem? Now, I don't have answers for any of these things, because I don't think there are, but they're things that we have to think about when we take on projects and we're asked to do things as a vet, because otherwise we can end up wasting a lot of time and money and actually accomplishing very little. So we'll talk about that a little bit later when we actually get into the presentation. So there were a bunch of other questions. Some of them are quite interesting. So Komodo dragons, it's difficult to say how much we'd feed them as a fixed quantity. So the beauty about them is that they're a cold-blooded animal. So they're something we call poikilothermic. And again, I'll apologize for those who are very erudite that it's too simplified, and I'll apologize to the children if it's too complicated. But basically, we always say that these were primitive animals, reptiles, and so they didn't regulate their own body temperature. But actually, they're supremely well evolved. They're not primitive at all. They've just decided on a different strategy to us. So Komodo dragons, in the old days, in the zoo, what we would do is we would actually feed them sort of small regular meals every day, just like we would eat. That's not a very clever way of doing things, because in the wild, they'd actually go and hunt something quite large, and then they'd gorge completely, and then they'd sit around being lazy and it digested, and they may not eat for several weeks. So it's a really clever strategy, because if you think, if you don't eat for a week, you're probably going to get ill. But if you're, say, a Komodo dragon, or more extreme, if you're a saltwater crocodile living in Australia, you could have a massive meal and then not eat for a year. So imagine you go home for Christmas, you see all your family, you eat a huge amount of food, and then you go, see you next year for Christmas, and you don't have to eat again in between. How can that be a more primitive way of living? So the old ways that they described in textbooks of animals being more highly developed or primitive meant we didn't really understand them, because they're really supremely evolved for the lifestyle that they need to live. So the question with the Komodo dragon is not how much they eat regularly, but how frequently and how big the meal that is they eat. So if they eat a really big meal, they don't have to eat for a long time, and they can eat a really massive amount, more than, a quarter to a third of their body weight at a sit, and then they'll just laze around for a week or two and just slowly start to digest that meal. Okay, and with snow leopards, there's a question on snow leopards there, and I'm getting a bit old and I'm a bit senile, so I'll forget half of the questions and I will apologize. But with snow leopards, when we watch TV, we'll see them all in these very, very isolated rocky mountains. And the reality is that many of the animals, what we think is natural now, is not actually where they occurred. So snow leopards actually also occurred much lower down mountains where there was a lot of vegetation and a lot more animals. But what's happened over hundreds of years is that as the human population has expanded and our farm animals have expanded, we've pushed these animals out to the extremes of where they would normally live, where we can't farm or we don't live. So we only see snow leopards in these little rocky outclips because no one wants to really live there. There's not many people, so they don't clash with us. But naturally, when there weren't a lot of people, they actually occurred in many more diverse habitats. And there were actually records of snow leopards killing young giant pandas and eating them, not something that you would see today because those habitats are very separated now. Daniela, do you want to remind me of some of those questions? Because I'm
also old and I don't remember. So I think
sorry.
There was a question. I don't know, Paolo. Can you play back the questions from the children, please?
Otherwise, some of them might actually.
Hello, I am Ilse. I am 6, 8. What is your favorite animal? Me is a dog. Bye.
Good evening, Dr. Pizzi. My name is Mattia and I'm 7-year-old. I would like to know how heavy a male lion is. Thank you.
Hello, I am Finn. I have a question for you. What is the weirdest animal you have ever treated? Bye.
Good evening, Dr. Pizzi. My name is Dante and I'm 10 years old and I go to 5th year primary school. I would like to know how many species of sloth live in the forest.
Hello everyone, I'm Greta. I was born in England, but I'm Italian. My mum and dad are Italian. I'm in year 1 primary school. The dragons are there in zoos, and how many foods do they have to eat to be healthy and safe? How many cubs does a snow leopard have, and what's its favorite food?
So they were asking which is your favorite animal and the weirdest animal you have.
Yeah, those are the ones that I missed. So I saw Finn asked what's the weirdest animal that I've treated. So I've treated some pretty bizarre animals. So we'll talk about it, but I've worked with very, very small, really endangered snails, and we'll come back to them because they may seem boring, but they're more important, those little snails, than many of them, probably any other animal I've ever worked with. But probably the weirdest animal I've treated is that I treated a group of sick jellyfish that were in a zoo, and that's got to be one of the strangest animals and most difficult animals to treat. But I've been lucky. I've worked with sharks and orangutans and all sorts of things, but I think the jellyfish are probably the weirdest. I'm afraid I don't have a favorite animal because I think what happens is it changes over time. So if I work with an animal, a type of animal for a lot of time, and I start to understand it a little bit better, then I start to become really fond of it. So it changes. So I used to work with lots of penguins, and I love penguins, and I've worked with pandas and orangutans. And the more you work with something, whether it's beavers or little lizards or ants, that, leafcutter ants, you become attached to or interested in all of them. So I like everything that's alive. I even like plants. So I'm very, very fond of trees. They live very long. They're really interesting. And there's a whole load of interesting things there. Did you know that plants can actually learn? And they seem to have memories. And we know they can communicate. So the whole living world is really, really amazing. Even plants are amazing.
I think it was a concept that was explained, forgive me if I'm wrong, in the movie Avatar about the plants or the vegetation communicating, and anyway, so I don't think it was.
There is some science. They've shown that what can happen is they can take, say, sensitive mimosa, which is a little plant that I will see in places like Sierra Leone. It's a little plant with fine little leaves, and what will happen is if you touch them or rain falls on them, the leaves fold up to protect themselves, and they would do that for rain, for wind, for animals trying to eat them. But what they can actually do is they can train the plant by dropping it, and then what will happen is they found that they can actually teach the plant that nothing bad is going to happen, and it won't close its leaves after it gets habituated to that. We know that plants have memory because a Venus flytrap has to actually be able to count and memorize how many times those hairs have been touched. So there's something complex going on there, that you've got plants that can count and can remember things. And then we know that they can communicate with their roots, with little fungal hyphae that spread between the roots of the trees in the forest. We know that they can feed elderly trees between them. There's all sorts of fascinating things. There's even some science that shows that trees can taste. So if you break off a branch from a tree, it may not do anything, but if a deer nibbles that off, and if a wind breaks it off, there are slightly different reactions. And so it appears that there are substances in the deer saliva when it chews on a tree's leaves, beech trees in Europe, that actually the tree recognizes it's been eaten, and what it will do is it will actually change the chemicals that it gives out into the leaves to make it unpalatable. But if you do the same thing with your hands, it doesn't fool the plant. So plants may even have a sense of taste. So there's so much we don't even understand about animals, but as we delve into the natural world, as we're losing it all the time, the tragedy is we realize how little we know about how interconnected all of life is.
Absolutely. Romain, we have heard a question from Greta, which you have answered. But am I allowed to say that you sent a nice video to Greta where we saw a little sweet creature? And if you are okay, I would like to send this video.
Sure, that's all right. It's just a little wallaby that was being hand reared, so she sent me a video, so I sent it back.
Paolo, shall we see the video with the little wallaby, please?
Greta, just a very quick video to say, hi, I'm Romain. Hopefully you'll enjoy my talk when it comes up, and I'll show you someone very special. I'll just turn the camera around. Here. So hopefully you can see him. This is Dash. He is a small Palmer wallaby baby that we've had to hand rear because his mother rejected him. So you can see he's actually living at the moment in this little artificial pouch, and he's just come out for an explore, so he's also saying hi. Anyway, that's bye from me now, and hopefully see you soon.
Romain, I'm a big fan, so every little story you got, I would say.
That's kind, but I think that the one thing that I have to say, being a vet, is that my job's actually really easy. We do the fun bit, and that we see sick animals and we treat them, but there's always an amazing group of people who actually do all the lifelong care of many of the animals, whether they're in a rescue center or they're being an orangutan being rehabilitated or a wallaby being hand reared. It's very easy for me as a vet to come along and treat some diarrhea or do an operation, but a baby otter that I might do something on, it'll take almost 2 years to go back to the wild, and there's a bunch of really dedicated people that will look after the otter. So my job's the easiest and the least important, because although everyone thinks it's very exciting, it's actually the other people around that I'm very dependent on, otherwise nothing would actually work.
I agree. This is very important to reiterate this. And yes, Romain, do you want to start with what you have prepared for us tonight? So they are all yours.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just check and see that you can see my screen, and then it really is a chat. So it's not the kind of high-powered talk for vets where you remember a number of doses and come away with all sorts of exciting bits and pieces. And I know there's a number of children, so I'll try hopefully to make it accessible for them, and maybe the adults will learn something as well. So I think we'll go on. So I think I've said, if you're expecting normal CPD, and we've got such wonderfully clever people, my wife is far more intelligent than me. She's got the brains. I just run around doing the crazy stuff. So if you want an intelligent talk, you really should ask my wife to do one for you, because I don't have half the brains that she does. But I have been very lucky. So for those who don't know me, probably because I'm not as clever as my wife, I fix things with my hands. Being a surgeon means I just have to remember a bit of anatomy, and I've sort of got a bit of experience now, so I can't remember dosages and things very well. But I have been very lucky to operate on all sorts of animals, some of them in zoos, some of them in the wild, some of them rescued and going back to the wild from orangutans in Borneo and Sumatra to bears in Vietnam, and penguins and beavers that have gone back to the wild, and pandas, and you name it. And that little video is actually some baby sharks inside the womb of their mom, and they didn't feel like coming out. And they're really fascinating because there's different types of sharks, and some of them will give birth to live young, so the eggs actually hatch inside the uterus, and they'll have a little yolk sac, and these are kind of angel sharks, so they're flat shark that lives in the bottom. They're critically endangered. We see them in Europe, and you can see their little eyes shining. And if they get hungry and they don't feel like going out, they'll eat each other. They can sometimes even gnaw on their mom's innards. And so the reason I was doing this is I was delivering them by hand, but they'd swim away from me and hide up at the top of the horns of the womb, the uterus. And so I'd have to stick my arm in, just like vet students would deliver lambs. But to find where they were hiding, I would stick in this old flexible endoscope and have a good look. So she's in water, and what we do is have a good look where the babies are, and then deliver them, and then she recovered and did well after them. So it is an unusual job, and I am very lucky.
Was she anesthetized?
Was she?
Was she anesthetized or sedated?
No, she was awake. So she stopped eating and became very flat because she had 18 baby sharks in her. And over 2 days, we would go in and deliver them, and then she would swim away, and then she would rest a bit, and then she recovered, and that's how we managed it. She was kept in a pool, so we could do that. So she gave birth to the very first one, and then nothing happened for about 3 weeks. So again, timescales, you could imagine if you went into labor and then did nothing for 3 weeks, we'd be in serious trouble, or dogs or cats that we work with, it wouldn't work. But obviously, every animal is slightly different, and for sharks, for this type of shark, an angel shark, it's different. So, I mean, there are some, I can make light of it, but there are some really, really very rare and very important animals left. And to answer, I think it was Finn's question about the weirdest animal, certainly the rarest animals that I've worked with are these tiny snails. And this is a very sad one that the picture is there with me, and that is a partula, a Polynesian tree snail, a very specific species. This was Partula faba. It was called Captain Cook's bean snail. It was discovered on Captain Cook's voyages around the Tahiti. And this is the very last of this species left on the planet. This was the very last snail left, unfortunately. And I was sadly trying to look after the last 9, and they dwindled away, and we just did not understand enough about them, and they sadly went extinct while I watched. And it was a horrible thing to know that there was a tiny enclosure with just this handful of snails, and watch an entire species go extinct as the vet responsible for that. The corollary is I've been very lucky in that we had another species of very endangered snail called Partulitinius simulans that came from another island in Tahiti that got down to its very, very last individual. And because snails are hermaphrodites, it had already been fertilized, and so it had eggs, and we looked after them, and eventually we had many hundreds of them, and we were actually able to return them back to the wild. So every year for about 3 years, zoos like London Zoo and Edinburgh Zoo actually sent these snails back to the wild. So from one individual left on the planet, it's incredible. That has got to be the most exciting and the most successful work I've ever done as a vet, is my tiny role in helping get from one of a species left to going back to the wild, an animal that was basically on the cusp of being extinct. So it's not elephants or anything else. That is definitely the rarest animal I've worked with. And here are a couple of others that we, there's an Amur leopard, and there are probably somewhere between about 50 and 100 left in the wild. There are a couple in zoos as well, so every time we work with one of those, it becomes important. Leopards, which are also critically endangered, there's only a handful left, so if you're asked to do anything with one of those, it becomes really important. And then there are animals that, like the little dove you'll see at the bottom, the Socorro dove, have done very basic orthopedic surgery on there. It's nothing fancy, but that bird is completely extinct in the wild. There were only about 100 left in zoos. So even an operation on that tiny bird is actually quite important for the genetics of the population. And things like this hairy-nosed otter. So unlike other otters, you'll actually see the bridge of the nose is covered in fur. It's something really, really unusual. There's only ever been 2 to 3 ever in captivity in rescue centres in Asia at any one time, and I've been lucky enough to help with a few of them. But people think they're extinct, and then they find one, and then they think they may be extinct because they don't see one for many years. So there are some really critically endangered animals out there that it doesn't matter on anyone's skill, but as vets we definitely have a role to play in trying to help them. Then of course, even if they're not particularly rare, there's some crazy patients, and I know some of you will have seen this slide, and I should probably have taken a picture of Vladimir Putin out if I don't want to be killed. But some of the challenges are obviously the animals. Some of them will try and eat us. Some of them are just difficult to feed. Some of the people involved can be particularly difficult. Sometimes the conditions are tricky. So, chimpanzees will remember me 10 years after I've worked with them, and they'll throw feces at me if I walk past in a zoo and I've forgotten about it, but they haven't if they recognize my voice. And if I take Yolanda and my children to any zoo, they have a great time, but as soon as I appear, all the animals stop screaming and run away and hide. And so no one wants me around when they go to the zoo because everything just hates me as a vet. And you can see that homemade dart gun in Cambodia that people have made from a bicycle pump and a deodorant can and an old Khmer Rouge gun. So we can work with crazy people, crazy equipment, some really interesting patients. They don't always love us, unfortunately. The other problem, and this is something I mentioned, is that we have to decide as vets what the heck we're actually trying to do. So there's a lot of confused messaging in the media, and we as vets are supposed to play a role often in conservation, but it's not actually clear what conservation is. And so it's not always clear if we're doing things that are constructive or not. So every 1st of January, there'll be a newspaper article about the annual stock take in all the famous zoos. But this is clearly nonsense, because for almost 20 years, all the zoos have had all of their animals counted on an electronic system so that anything, even a mouse that dies or is born, is recorded immediately. So we all know the numbers in all the zoos. And actually, it's a legal requirement in the UK. If you've got a zoo, to have a zoo license, is you have to have an up-to-date inventory, we call it, at all times, and it has to be sent to the local authorities. So something that existed 50 years ago where people weren't quite sure what was going on in the zoo has become a bit of a media nonsense, and it's good publicity for some of the zoos. But you can't always believe everything that there is in the media. We also hear a lot about scientists doing something for conservation or to save an animal, whether it is gluing a tag on a sea turtle or doing something with other animals in the wild. And some of these procedures can be very invasive. So we can bolt radio transmitters to the actual fin of sharks and dolphins, and that's something that's quite painful and will actually disturb that animal's life for the rest of its life. It will interfere with how it swims. And we have to be very critical of why we do this. So we do know that we do need some information, but there's a fine line between balancing what we're actually going to get from certain types of information and the impact it has on animal lives. And it's difficult to know where the balance is. How many animals will we harm for information that may help us? And some of it is sometimes questionable, so we do have to question it. And then commonly we'll see newspaper articles, and sometimes even the BBC makes this mistake about rare white tigers that have been born and they're critically endangered. But we know white tigers are nonsense, that they've been selectively bred in many zoos in parts of Asia because they're appealing to the visitors. And so the zoos will put out a lot of misinformation, and people actually will think that these are actually a critically endangered animal, whereas basically they're an artificial animal that we've created. So there are other things that we sort of need to think about. So we've got so many species going extinct, but we're talking about maybe bringing back the mammoth. And that would be very exciting, but does it make sense to bring back or to try and focus on very, very expensive and very complicated techniques when we're sort of not really able to save little bits of habitat that we need to keep animals alive, as it is the species that we do have? And some animals just do not do very well in captivity. African hunting dogs roam over huge areas, have a really, really complicated family system in that you can have 20, 30 dogs, and there'll be an alpha male and an alpha female. They're the only ones that will breed. And they actually almost have jobs, because there'll be some females that will stay and look after all the cubs, and they'll actually lactate although the cubs are not theirs and they'll look after them, there'll be others that will teach young hunting dogs to hunt, and then the pack will have different roles. There'll be chasers, there'll be those that are better at ambushing and strategy. So they have a very complex social system. And even keeping them in huge national parks like the Masai Mara is difficult. They roam over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of land. And so they're an animal that's almost not viable in the wild anymore. And keeping them in a zoo is very difficult in any sort of natural way. So we have to try and think about what we're trying to achieve. And as vets, we're constantly faced with all these dilemmas. We're asked to do things for projects and we're paid. Sometimes they don't always make sense. And if we even just stick to the very, very basic question of what we mean by conservation and what we're trying to accomplish, we don't have a consensus. And there are basically two ways that people tend to think of conservation. There's the reserve way, where what we'll do is that the world is full of people and our domestic animals, and we'll come to that a little bit later. And what we need to do is have big fenced-off areas, and anything that can live in there and that's protected is great. And we might go and visit them as tourists, and that's wonderful, and that's conservation. But anything that can't survive in those reserves is going to go extinct. And the other way of thinking about conservation is, do we want a patchwork of conservation so that animals live amongst us and there are corridors and there's a bit of wildlife everywhere? Now, that's very appealing. We all like to see a hedgehog in our garden, or a fox, or to see badgers, or to see the garden birds come into our garden. But it becomes really difficult as we build and we cut off these little islands. Species like birds can fly between these groups, but hedgehogs can't survive when there's tiny isolated patches and there's not enough food, and neither can many other animals. So it becomes really complicated because the ways of accomplishing these two very different strategies are completely different. And if everyone is very muddled up about what they're trying to actually achieve, we don't get anywhere. And so it does always worry me that we have all these little projects that we work on, and we focus here on protecting some habitat, and there we focus on a reserve, there we focus on corridors, here we focus on a subspecies, say the Scottish wildcat, and there we're working on tigers. And sometimes we're doing artificial insemination in a breeding program, but it doesn't always fit together to make a meaningful picture. And that's something that as veterinarians and people who work with wildlife, we always have to keep an eye on. Anyway, that's enough of a boring rant and something just to think about. But again, in terms of impact, these tiny little snails that I worked with, they've had much more. That's been the most important conservation project I've ever worked on, compared to working with rhinos or orangutans or almost any other animal. But again, they're not something you'll see in the newspaper, because big fancy animals are always what everyone's in love with. And then we have to be very careful. We can do a lot of harm as veterinarians. So everyone thinks vets are wonderful. We rush around and save animals and all we do is good. But if we don't think, we can do more harm than good. So when the Californian condor, the last few Californian condors were taken into captivity because they were about to go extinct, veterinarians were very conscientious, and they examined them and they found some feather lice and they treated them for parasites. And that's all very good, but they've forgotten the big picture, because bird lice are actually very unique. Many bird lice are very, very unique to their hosts. So the thing is, you're saving the condor, but you're killing off an entire species of louse. That is not actually very harmful. So bird lice will chew on feathers and they're kept at low levels. But then we have to question, well, why are we doing what we're doing? So you're protecting the condor and you're making a louse extinct. You might not like lice, they're not pretty, you're not going to pay to go to a zoo and see lice in a cage. But the thing is that the ecosystems are all intertwined and they're all equally important, and they don't always function well if we take things out of context. And the same in South Africa with elephants is, you might be asked to move some elephants between reserves or do something else or check, treat an injury. And as part of that, you treat the elephant for parasites because you're worried it may be thin. But the problem is the drugs that we use may go out in the dung and kill off all the dung beetles. And if we kill off the dung beetles, that will affect many of the birds and the small mammals and everything else. So as a vet, we've treated the elephant. That's what we've been paid to do by the people in the reserve. But we've forgotten the big picture that is surrounding it. And so we have to really be careful that we're actually doing something meaningful and that we're not just working with fancy big animals because that's what everyone sees, and that we're actually trying to accomplish something that is more holistic, and that makes more sense altogether. And we know some parasites are really endangered. There's only a handful that are recognized as some. These tiny little pigs that are really, really unique in one area of India called the pygmy hog. They have a very specific louse, and it is a parasite that bites them. So as vets, if we see people's dogs and cats, we treat them for ticks and fleas. But this louse is only found on these endangered hogs. So the parasite is more endangered than the pigs, and we can't treat them for the parasite because the parasite is just as important in the ecosystem as they are. So things that as veterinarians working with dogs and cats we forget. And now a bit to a little bit easier going things, something maybe that the children who've almost wandered off and gone and playing with the Lego might be able to come back and see some pictures and think about things about how, just day-to-day bits about how we'd approach some of the cases and the challenges that we would as vets, in faraway countries. This is a picture in Ethiopia, working with some lions that are rescued here. But there is still so much we don't understand, even about our own bodies. And the gorilla is a really good example. So this is a picture just to show, if we could look inside a gorilla, that would be the x-rays we'd see. And if we could see the ultrasound of the heart inside, we could see this. And we know that people get a lot of heart disease, but we're always told that people get heart disease because we eat too much rubbish and we don't get enough exercise. And so that's why we get heart disease. But even in zoos, we can give gorillas really healthy diets. They're only eating vegetables, getting a lot of fiber. We can give them a lot of exercise. And heart disease is still one of the main problems we get in gorillas. It's slightly different to the heart disease we get in people, but there's still a problem there, and we really don't know why. And there are many, many different contentious theories. Some people say that mostly we're getting it in gorillas because in captivity they're not getting the same levels of vitamin D that they would, and that's doing something with it. There's other theories that there's something vital missing from their diet that we can't replicate. So one suspect is there's a kind of white melangula pepper, kind of a spice that we sometimes use in cooking, that they actually would consume in the wild, and that's perhaps got some sort of properties that we don't fully understand. But the truth is we don't know. So we can reduce even the complexity of our own healthcare to very simple things. Some animals are very obvious. We'll see lots of things with rhinos in the press constantly and poaching, and it is a tragedy. They're actually not a difficult animal to anaesthetize. So here's one with a dart in its bum, and how a dart gun works is it's basically a syringe with two sections, and the front section has drug, and the section at the back basically has a bit of compressed air in. And the reason the drug just doesn't come squirting out is we've got a special needle on there that's got two holes on the sides. We cover that with a little collar of plastic so that when the dart is sitting there on the side, it's under pressure, but the drug can't come out. But when we actually shoot it into an animal using carbon dioxide or compressed air, what will happen is as the needle enters in, it pushes that little collar back, and suddenly those two little ports, those two little holes on the sides of the needle are open, and then the drug can actually be injected. So darting rhino is not particularly difficult. It's not much fun for the rhino. I would say darting any animal is painful. As you could imagine, if someone threw a dart in your leg, it's not a fun thing. So if we can find other ways to do this, we do. And so in zoos, what we'll often do is just give them a bucket of fruit, and the rhino's really hungry, and it'll stick its face in there and it'll start eating a bunch of fruit. And what we can do is we can actually use the tiny little veins that are on the edges of the ears, just as vets who work with dogs and cats and rabbits will use with rabbits. And we can actually put a little needle in there and we can inject. And they almost don't notice. They think it's just a fly biting them. They may flick their ear. You can put some local anesthetic or whatever. And they just go to sleep. Really no stress, no pain. That's much easier to manage than obviously darting them. But with wild rhino, we do have to dart them. And one tricky thing with rhino to remember is that despite everything we hear in the media, rhino are not endangered. They're classed as vulnerable. White rhino are probably the biggest conservation success story of any of the big animals. So in South Africa 100 years ago, there were a handful left. There were probably only about 20 or 30 of them left in the wild. In one tiny reserve, they almost went extinct. And Hluhluwe-Mfolozi Reserve in what used to be KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa was the only place they occurred. But what happened is they protected them and they bred really well, and they figured out how to anaesthetize them and move them, and they were moved all over Southern Africa. And so we have almost 20,000 rhinos from about 100 years ago to 20,000. So they've gone from being critically endangered to actually just being vulnerable. So they're no more endangered than moose or European otters. But they are sadly still poached, and that is a tragedy. It's horrible, obviously, if a rhino is killed and its face is hacked off. But it's also a loss for many of the people that own these rhinos on private reserves. And so some of the stories we hear in the media are not entirely truthful, because poaching is not about to make rhinos extinct. And a lot of the noise is because people will lose money if they've spent a lot of money buying a lot of rhino and put them in reserves. So there's a lot of complexity to all these stories that we will get simplified in the media, and we have to always think about why we're being told a story and if it makes sense. And the sad thing is that while everyone is very aware of all the poaching of rhino in Africa, rhinos are almost extinct in the rest of the world. So I was working in Vietnam when they found that the very, very last Surg rhino went extinct in Vietnam. We always thought there were about 12, and there was a lady doing a survey with the dogs, sniffing out their feces to try and collect feces and do genetics to see how many were left. And she only ever found feces from one female, and then no feces for 2 months, and then they found a dead body. But there was very little said about that, because you're working in a difficult country and there's a lot of conservation organizations trying to help, and it's a failure, and no one wants to talk about failures. So there's no one who will gain from that story, because officials will lose their jobs and organizations won't get donations if it's failed. And so that's a sort of a silent failure, whereas every rhino that's killed in South Africa, because it has an owner, it's a financial loss, and so the story becomes very big. And it is a tragedy, but it's not quite the story that we're always told. So talking about anesthesia, I thought it was a good one to start with. I'm not a specialist anesthesia. I know just enough to know what's going on when I'm doing my operations. There's some really challenging patients, and this is probably one of the worst ones. This is a walrus. There aren't that many in captivity anymore, and catching them in the wild is nightmarish. And what you'll see is that this walrus looks like it's been driven over by a truck. It's completely flat. So that doesn't do great things when you're under anesthesia and you're trying to breathe for this animal, or it has to breathe for its own, because normally it will be living in water and its body will be suspended in the water. So when it's on land, it has to put an increased effort to breathe. So when we anesthetize animals, obviously we overcome some of those mechanisms and they won't breathe as well. And they have it's not really completely accurate, but we describe a dive reflex, where their body really gets confused, to keep it simple for the children that are listening. And their body is not getting the same balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the drugs that we've given have changed how dilated and constricted the blood vessels are in the different parts of the body. And so the body thinks it's underwater, and it thinks that it needs to save the oxygen it has. And so what will happen is they will slow down their heart rate, and they will make a bunch of changes in their body. And if we're not careful when we anesthetize them, this is like they were diving deep underwater, and they can actually die. So they're nightmare patients to anesthetize. And if you did have to rescue them or keep them in the zoo, because they will dredge up soft sand on the seabeds looking for clams with those amazing whiskers, which we call fibrissae, which have lots of nerves. So they're almost more sensitive than their eyes. That's how they find a lot of their food. But if they do that in a concrete pool, they wear through the enamel on their teeth, and they've got very peculiar teeth. And what will happen is they've got quite big pores in the dentine. That's the second layer of the tooth, where the nerves are in to help them to feel what's going on in the seabed. So if they wear away that enamel, they get horrible infections, and they get big abscesses in their face, and they can get really sick and die. And so for many of the walruses, if they're rescued or they're in captivity, we have to actually put like titanium caps on, and they'll break them periodically, and they need to get refitted. So they look like some sort of gangster hip-hop artist with these crazy teeth if you come across them. So some animals are a lot less exotic. This little snake, you might see one in a practice. We might keep one as a pet, but we have little quirky ways of keeping them asleep as well. To make a little tube to be able to breathe for the snake, we're using an intravenous catheter. So that's the little soft plastic thing that they put in your arm if you went into a hospital, or Daniela or most of the vets who work with dogs and cats will put in their vein to give some fluids, to give medicines, to make things safe under anesthesia. And we can actually use that, steal that, put that on a syringe, and put that down this tiny windpipe to breathe for a snake. And obviously, unlike Harry Potter, snakes can't blink. So if you watch the Harry Potter movie with your parents, you can have a laugh, because J.K. Rowling didn't know snakes very well, because she says that the snake winks at Harry at London Zoo, but snakes have they don't have no eyelids, but they don't have eyelids that can wink, because what you're actually seeing of the surface of the eye is their fused eyelids, and they're see-through, and they're called the spectacle. And that's because if you're living in sand, you don't want to get sand in your eyes, so they fused their eyelids and made them transparent, and they'll actually shed them with the rest of their skin, but they definitely can't wink. And even if they're anesthetized or asleep, their eyes always look the same. Just a useless bit of information. Other patients give us even more crazy challenges. So this is a giant anteater, which has a tiny, tiny opening to its mouth, and it's got a very, very long tongue that shoots out and grabs ants. And so the opening to the windpipe for an anesthetist can be about 60 centimeters to a meter long from their mouth, and it's actually at the entrance to their chest. So to put a tube down to breathe for one of these animals at anesthesia it's not impossible, but it's very difficult. We have to use special endoscopes, and it really is quite tricky to do. So if we think about anesthesia, is always great if we need to anesthetize dangerous animals that are going to eat us, but there are animals that we might just be able to handle, but they may be venomous and we don't want to get bitten. So you will see sometimes on TV and books, you'll see people using a snake hook, and I've caught snakes that are venomous on drug raids for the police, and snakes when I was a child that used to come into the bedroom and things. And so we have to understand what we're actually doing. So snakes have an amazing skull, and that very little is connected, because if you're going to eat something much bigger than your head, it's not that you dislocate your jaws, it's that you actually have an extra set of joints. So snakes have a joint here like we do, but they also have a joint here. So this can move. You can move your bottom jaw back and forth, and they have no connection at the front of their top and bottom jaws. They also have an extra row of teeth on the inside and the roof of their mouth. So they have 6 separate rows of teeth, and that way, by moving their bottom and top jaws all separately with a bunch of ligaments, they can walk these separate 6 almost mini jaws over something really big. So a big rock python can swallow a whole antelope by stretching the skin and walking these backwards pointing teeth over something. Now we can misuse this when we handle snakes by pinning their head down with a snake hook. And because all of this is very loose, it sort of squashes the head, and the head itself acts like a shock absorber. But things can actually go wrong, because where the skull of a snake is joined to the spine is actually really, really weak, much weaker than us. They have one little joint where the skull actually joins to the neck. And so it's a much weaker connection than most animals. And so if we're not careful with our hook and we push down there, we'll paralyze the snake, and that will be no good. It will be permanently hurt. So sometimes the best way of using a hook is actually just to scoop up the snake and put it in a bag or in a box so we can move it somewhere else, rather than actually trying to handle it by hand, especially if it's venomous. Sometimes we can catch animals in ways that we may not always like. So snaring can be a really cruel way of trapping animals to control them. But in the Russian Far East, where there's Amur leopards and Amur tigers, they live over such huge areas of land. You can wait months and months to catch one. So many cage traps and other things won't work. So vets used to actually use snares. Now they used a very special snare. It's padded with a thick plastic around it, and what they used to do is they used to be connected to a series of bells. So if you caught one of the endangered leopards, then what would happen is the bells would go off and people could hear it and they'd come. Nowadays, it's actually connected to a little electronic alarm that will phone you if you're sitting in a tent waiting for weeks and weeks for one of the leopards, and you'll know it's there instantly, and you can run there with a dart gun and actually dart it. You'll know exactly where it is. But, some animals are very, very difficult to actually catch for us to do anything. And then as vets, we all like to squeeze animals' abdomens and give them a good clinical exam, but how do you examine a porcupine? So they're not particularly amenable to being handled. And even if we anesthetize them, they have quills on the underside. So they pose a challenge. And we do usually have to anesthetize porcupines. What works really well is a big rubbish bin. So a big rubber rubbish bin. We'll catch a porcupine, we'll put the lid on, we'll make a little hole, we'll put our anesthetic gas pipe in there, and we'll get them to go to sleep, and we'll take them out very carefully. And those quills are really it's not that they're sharp, it's that if we look at their surface under the microscope, they have fine little spines on them, and so they'll embed and break off under the skin. And porcupines are the main reason that lions used to become man-eaters, is that young lions would make the mistake and they'd think they're an easy meal. They'd attack a porcupine, they'd get all these quills broken off in their legs, and they'd never come out. And so the lions would be disabled and they'd never be able to run fast enough to catch anything except people. And so many of the man-eating lions shot 100 years ago, when they looked at them after they'd been shot, they had lots of porcupine quills stuck in their legs, maybe for many months. But even now we've got our porcupine anesthetized and we have a good feel, things feel very different to how they would in a dog and a cat. And a porcupine can have a really big spleen that sits almost in its pelvis, and if you're not used to it, you might think it's a tumor. So a big challenge for us as vets is even just recognizing what may be normal in many of the weird animals we work with. And so here's an example. One of the most basic things, you'd hope if you went to the doctor, they look in your eye, but vets will often have a very good look in an animal's eye, because what we're trying to do is we can detect all sorts of diseases. Because the eye is amazing, and it can do such, it can translate bits of light that are bounced off objects and they hit the eye, and then our brain interprets it and tells us what's going on in the world. It's really amazing. But the problem is all these little light particles, these photons, have a lot of energy and a lot of heat. So if we didn't have a fantastic blood supply, they'd just burn up the retina and you'd go blind. So we have a lot of blood supply to the eye, but that means infections and health problems actually often show up in the eye. But eyes can be very different in the animal kingdom. So when you go to bird's eyes, this is an owl, they don't have round eyes. So if you actually look at this eye, you will see this eye is mushroom-shaped, and it has bones in it. These little yellow bits are actually bone. So the front of the eye is the smallest part of the eye, and that's why owls can have very, very, really good eyesight at night. And this is not just owls. Many other birds also don't have round eyes, and they'll have these huge eyes. And if you shine light in one eye, because they're so close together, some owls are even closer together, it often transmits to the other eye, and so that pupil will change as well. But this means that if an owl flies into something, so a window or the windscreen of a car, this very delicate structure is damaged. Because if you had a big eye and it was all floppy like our eye was, when you flew and you landed on a perch, it would all wobble, and so it would keep going in and out of focus. And that's why they have these rigid eyes with bones in. But it does mean that they're very easily damaged. And when we get an injured owl in Scotland, probably 8 out of every 10 owls will have very, very serious injuries to its eye. And if you didn't pick that up as a vet, that owl will be blind, and the owl with only one eye won't be able to tell any depth, and so it won't be able to catch anything to eat, and it would starve if you released it, even if it had nothing wrong with it. And when we examine the eye, it looks completely different. So in the back of the eye, there are no blood vessels. There's this wiggly black thing called the pectin, which is like a clump of blood vessels, which gives nutrition to the eye. And in birds has the advantage that you don't have the blood vessels interfering with sight. So you got to know that's normal, otherwise you wouldn't be able to interpret if there was a problem or not. So taking blood from different animals is different. So, we take blood from the tails in cows. We don't generally do it in dogs. I think if Daniela took blood from one of her patients by lifting up its tail in front of the owners, they'd probably be horrified and she'd be getting all sorts of angry phone calls. But for some animals, this is the way to go. So this is a beaver, and this beaver's awake, but we can bundle it into a potato bag and we can take the tail out. But the blood vessels will all dilate because beavers are really insulated and living in cold water. Blood vessels will be small so they don't lose heat. So we have to stick the tail on a hot water bottle before we can get our blood sample to do anything with it. And then when we look at the blood sample we've got, because we know for dogs and cats and cows and horses and everything we're familiar with, that will give us a lot of information. And so you'll see there's a little parasite here looking at you called Babesia in the blood vessel of this Pierre David's deer. Now, this is a really, really interesting animal. Pierre David's deer was saved in the UK, actually, from extinction. And what happened is they were very rare in China, and they only existed in the imperial hunting grounds for the Chinese royalty to hunt. And then there was the Boxer Rebellion, and the hunting grounds were overrun by people who were starving, and they shot and killed and ate the last of these deer. But a couple had been smuggled out to zoos in Europe, and thankfully the Duke in Woburn made a collection of them, and the rest of the deer, when the World War broke out, were eaten. And so there was a tiny population that stayed in England, and eventually they've sent them back to China to go back to the wild. But they've got a quirky thing. If we make a blood smear, we'll see these very weird looking blood cells. Now, people get a disease called sickle cell anemia, where they get these kind of strange shaped blood cells. But deer seem to get this a lot, but it actually seems to be normal and it doesn't make them ill. And so we think that what happens is the genes are actually different to people, but they may have evolved for similar reasons, because in parts of the world where sickle cell anemia is a problem, there are a lot of genes that give resistance to blood parasites. So these deer have these very strange, bizarre, spindle-shaped cells, and it actually is linked to them having some resistance and coping better with the blood parasites. So if we didn't know this is normal for a deer, you'd have a heart attack if you saw that blood smear, and you'd think it was going to drop dead, but actually it's perfectly normal. And then those are things that we can see, and we all see pictures on the news of turtles choking on plastic and birds, that have eaten plastic. And we're all very, very aware of plastic pollution, and plastic pollution is terrible. But there are things that are more problematic in the environment that we can't see, and the media doesn't tend to tell us very much about because they can't give us a picture. So chemical pollution is probably even bigger problem for many animals than plastic pollution is. So for animals like polar bears, they live at the top of the food chain, and they accumulate all the toxins that will be in the food chain below them. So even nasty chemicals like mercury and chrome that we try not to use in many manufacturing processes anymore, you'll still see very high levels of them in the Arctic Circle because they stick around for decades. And there's so many synthetic chemicals, unfortunately, that we don't yet know the effects of. But we do know that lots of plastic manufacturers, lots of petrochemicals have a bunch of compounds. There's digoxins. There's, there are a lot of compounds that get accumulated in the fat of these animals, and they will affect their reproduction. So orcas, we have very few orcas left around the coasts of the UK. There's a tiny pod in Scotland. They haven't had a live baby for, I think, more than 2 decades, and they will go extinct. And we think the main reason is the levels of toxins. And the sad fact now is that in many countries, like the USA, if an orca, so a killer whale, actually dies, they contain so many toxic chemicals now, they actually classified as hazardous waste. So it's a very sad state of affairs when a wild animal that dies is actually toxic waste, and it's all our fault, unfortunately. So moving away to happier things, there are things that we can do that are quite unusual. We like to do ultrasound. You saw the ultrasound of the gorilla's heart, but we can actually look inside the brains of very young animals like foxes and see if they've got problems with their brains, like hydrocephalus, before they wean, because we can't detect this until they're older, and they obviously wouldn't be able to cope in the wild. But looking at really big animals can be really a challenge. So elephants are very big. I'd love to be able to take them to a CT scanner. It's a very fancy piece of equipment, but many of the places that we'd want to work, you can see the terrain. You're not going to be able to take this thing in a big truck anywhere, even if you could. And even if you did, you're not going to be able to stick an elephant through a CT scanner to see what's going on. Maybe a penguin. You'll see what's going on from all these fancy slices of x-rays that builds up a 3D picture. So we've had to come up with ways of solving this problem in a different way if we deal with wild elephants, or elephants in different parts of the world, and sometimes even in zoos. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of money, you don't have a CT scanner big enough for an elephant. So when I was a child, we had this toy called the viewfinder, and it had pictures and cartoons and things, and they were in 3D because your 2 eyes saw slightly different images. And we can do the same thing with animals, as we can just make a simple wooden cassette, and we can actually, an anesthetized animal or elephant's foot, we can place it on there, we can take an x-ray, we move the x-ray itself, x-ray generator just a little bit, about 10 centimeters, we flip out that x-ray plate, so that takes the picture, we put another one in, and we get 2 pictures. And what we can actually do is we can make 3D x-rays, and they're not as good as a CT scan, but they're better than a flat CT scan. And what will happen with them is that we can tell, is that little line that we're seeing across the bone, is it actually a crack, or is that an abscess near the bone, or is it actually just a rough part on the sole of the elephant? There's a little sole abscess that we need to trim, rather than there's a disaster inside the foot deep. And that's all that we sometimes need, and we couldn't get with any other way but them doing this. So there are always different ways of doing this. And when we think about looking inside animals, we talked about ultrasounding inside brains and x-rays inside feet. The other thing is that sometimes the animals can look back at us. So here there's a pregnancy scan on a dolphin, but we know that dolphins can actually echolocate, and dolphins can actually tell if a pregnant woman is in the water. They can actually tell if she's pregnant or not. So their echolocation, their form of almost ultrasound, if you like, can travel through water, and they can actually do a pregnancy diagnosis on the people around them, which makes you think, if you're doing an ultrasound in water, can that baby dolphin fetus, if it's near term, can it actually see you back? So when you're ultrasounding the dolphin, can the baby actually see that you're doing it? It's all very interesting. It can't hear the ultrasound because the frequency is too high for what dolphins can hear, but it may still be able to send its own echolocation frequency at your hand and at least see the strange hand making contact with its mom's belly and wonder what's going on. Or if you're doing it completely in the water, it may actually be able to see you in the water next to it. Something just to boggle your mind there a little bit. And again, we use other ways to see inside animals. So, it's very easy to take an animal's temperature in the vets. If it's a dog or a cat, and it may not be much fun for the dog that it gets a thermometer shoved up its bum. And I remember as a child when we were not cooperative with the old mercury thermometers in the doctors, and the nurse used to say to us, if you don't keep it underneath your tongue, it's going to go up the other end. And so we'd be really well behaved so that the thermometer wouldn't go in another place that we didn't want it to go. But dogs and cats are not so lucky, but we may not be able to catch a zebra to be able to tell its temperature. And so we can use a thermal camera, and we can actually see if this zebra has a sore knee, and you can see one of those two front knees is slightly whiter. This one, it's banged its knee on something. But we don't have to catch it. We can actually see there's a little bit of a temperature there, and it works. Because if we have an injury, the blood vessels dilate to bring more healing cells there, and what will happen is those blood vessels are dilated and they give off more heat that is coming from the center of the body where the heart pumps it out. And so we detect that as heat. But we can also use this in strange ways, because penguins are completely insulated. But if we stick a thermometer up their bum, they often have a poop and suck air up in there, and we can't get an accurate temperature. So the best place to take a penguin's temperature is actually its eye, because it's so supremely insulated, and the feet, the blood vessels in the feet will contract or dilate to regulate them losing temperature. So we can't rely on that. But the only place that they cannot control where they lose heat is the surface of their eye. And because they have a really big eye, we can actually work out what is a normal eye temperature for a penguin. And so we can actually detect a penguin that's ill faster than any other method by looking at their eye surface temperature, which is a really bizarre way of thinking about taking temperatures. Of course, there's other things we can do with treating our patients. This is a root canal in a line, and obviously it's a lot more technically difficult than it is in doing in a person. But again, that's fairly simple. A lion's tooth is just a big version of a cat's tooth. When you think of a Komodo dragon, their teeth erupt in a completely different way. They actually come in sideways, so they will snap off teeth and they will regrow them, a little bit like sharks. They're not quite so extreme. Other animals are born with the teeth they're going to have for the rest of their life. So if you have a newborn seal, or a 1 or 2 week old seal, and it comes in off the beach and it's rescued and got bashed against the rocks and it's lost a lot of teeth, that's its problem for the rest of its life. Seals, so grey seals and harbour seals that we'll see here in Scotland and England, they actually lose their milk teeth while they're in the uterus. So that's really unusual. So, most children get 2 sets of teeth so they can eat rubbish and sweets and biscuits and learn how to brush their teeth, and they get rotten teeth, and then they get a proper set that they're then supposed to look after for the rest of their life. Or if you're someone silly like me, you don't, and then you have a bunch of fillings. But if you're a seal, if you damage your teeth very soon after you're born, those teeth are damaged and you don't get any new ones. And so nutrition is also something that can be very challenging to us. So, looking after a lion is fairly easy, and we can hand rear them, and it isn't actually that different to a kitten. But some animals' diets are really, really crazy and very, very difficult to replicate. So if you think of manatees, they're beautiful, they're called sea cows. You'll see them in Florida and you'll see them in South America grazing on seagrass. When we have to rehabilitate them and we keep them in captivity, we often give them lettuce, which is a very, very low calorie food. If you think about it, I've got a fat belly, my son says I'm cuddly, I need to go on a diet. What do I eat? I eat salad because it's got low calories. But if you give romaine lettuce to manatees, not only do they get obese, it's such unhealthy nutrition for them. They often get diabetes because seagrass is so low in calories and so low in nutrition, and they've evolved over millions of years to eat that even lettuce is the equivalent of them eating a cheeseburger. So you have to think about what's healthy for one animal may not be healthy for another animal. And when we raise a lion, we may think for us it's nice to have a meal once a day or twice a day or whatever, however often you eat. Most people 3 times a day. Me and my wife usually twice a day if we're good. But for a lion, that's not natural. If you give them small amounts of food, it actually causes all sorts of nutritional problems. And we need to give them all sorts of different parts of the animal they would normally eat. So they're designed to eat massive meals and literally gorge themselves and sit under a tree and then rest for days and days on end. And maybe they'll only eat every 5, 6, 7 days, but they'll have a very, very big meal when they do. And that's something that we have to remember when we're trying to rear them or release animals, that we try and feed them in a way that's natural. Otherwise, we end up with problems. So the other thing is that when we come to neutering animals, so a hyena might look like a dog, but things are slightly different inside in that when we have hyenas, it's actually the girls that are the dominant ones. So hyena packs, the moms have to be the strongest to chase off the lions, and the male hyenas are a little bit like henpecked husbands, possibly a little bit like me, that run around and behave ourselves. Otherwise, we're told to we're going to be in trouble. So they actually have, female hyenas will have more testosterone than male hyenas to be able to protect their babies. And so when we look at their genitalia, it's really bizarre. They don't have the same structures we'd see in other female animals. They've actually fused a lot of it. They actually look like they have a penis, and they don't actually have the normal labia. They have what looks like a scrotum. It is all very different. But it also means, as a vet, if we need to neuter one and they're in a group, we can't just do what we would do in a dog and cat. If we take the ovaries out, we change the hormones, we'll change the behavior, and it will cause the whole group to fight and their whole hierarchy to fall apart. So if we neuter one of them, we leave the ovaries in and we take the uterus out, something very different to what would happen with a normal dog or a cat. And then obviously we need to get animals back to the wild. If we're treating them and we're breeding them, then that's one of the ultimate aims of why we will be working with many of these animals. But the problem is, for all the work and time and effort that we put in, how do we know it works? And this is always the problem, is that we can release a snow leopard that we've done something with or we've treated for a snare injury, but it might be dead 2 days later and we may never find it. We may never know. It might hide in a cave and us not find it. So we will often resort to using radio collars and satellite trackers and things, but these always come as a cost to the animal. So we have to decide if it is going to give us enough information to be worth the risk, because there's a risk that this could hurt an animal. It's heavy, it can interfere with its hunting. We know from the very, very first time they ever tried to use radio transmitters on wild animals, they were on sage grouse. They were a bit of a disaster. All the sage grouse that they put them on died very quickly. And we do know from birds of prey, putting wing tags on their wings, putting satellite trackers, it interferes with how animals move, and it actually does make it more difficult for them to survive. So when we see things with radio trackers, we always have to be careful that the information that we're going to get and our ability to do something with it outweighs the harm that we're actually doing to the animal. And an obvious example would be things like bears, that for many years when they've been studied, the way of studying bears has to actually implant transmitters in their abdomen, because they're not, you can't really put a collar on a bear because they go through feast and famine. So bears hibernate, they lose all their weight, they come out in the spring, they're really skinny. Some bears can almost double their weight by the time they go into hibernation. They gorge on salmon if they're in North America, or just eat everything they can get their paws on, and so their weight changes so much there's no way of putting anything like an external collar on them. So that means they need to be anesthetized, and we put something in their abdomen. But things can go wrong with this. So there are reports where these things blow up inside. the batteries leak, they can kill bears, they can become infected. And so again, even though this is invisible to us, it can cause a harm. And the pity is this can also be misused. So when I was a child in South Africa, tourists want to go and see the big five. So they pay a lot of money, they come all the way from overseas, and they'll stay in a fancy safari lodge, and then they want to see the animals. And in the old days, you had to get up at 5 in the morning, and you had to go driving around when they were most active and take part last. Or you paid a lot of money if you were wealthy, and you got a tracker, and they were out early, and they were tracking where the animals were moving, and they try and help you find them. But our patience is gone, and people are very rushed, and so you may fly into South Africa and only spend 2 or 3 days there. You want to see all these animals, and how do you find them? There are very few of the original Bushman trackers left, and there's too many little private reserves and places to go and see animals. So unfortunately, what often happens is that vets will have to anaesthetize lions and actually put radio trackers in their abdomen just so the tourists know where to find them. So in the morning, you can get up late in the morning and they'll say, oh, we know where the lions are, you head in this area, or they'll take you out on a tour, and you're almost guaranteed to see lions. And it's because no one wants to see lions with a big radio transmitter around their neck. So they actually have them in their abdomen. And so this is where, as vets, we have to be very careful what we're doing. Are we doing this for the animals' benefits? Are we doing this for the people's benefits? And it all becomes rather murky, and we have to be quite careful about it. So I thought to end with, I'll show you a couple of bits and pieces. Daniela can tell me if I'm way over time and I just need to stop, but I thought I'd show you some crazy surgery cases, and then you can, if anyone wants to ask anything.
You can go ahead and talk, because
okay, I can go right for a bit. So, I mean, surgery is what I tend to do. People don't, I'm not very good at anesthesia and many of the other bits. I have to do little bits of it sometimes, but I try to stay to what I can. But again, it's a little bit different with some of my patients have to go back into water. So you can see there's a seal. The eye has got to heal well enough that it doesn't have a cavity, because otherwise you'll get a hermit crab or something trying to live there in the seal's face. So it has to be operated on sometimes slightly differently to how we may do with another animal. And we do a lot of keyhole surgery, and we may not even clip animals' fur if we're going to operate on them, because we want them to keep their waterproofing, such as these beavers. My patients are not very good at keeping themselves quiet. So, if you've got broken bones and you go to the hospital and you feel sorry for yourself, and they will do an operation, and then they give you a cast, and everyone at school will draw on your cast and write you get well messages. But some of my patients are really stupid, and as soon as you've done an operation, they'll jump in a tree and try and be silly and beat up. There's a mom trying to play with her son there and tell him what to do. So the way that we repair things, it very quickly tells us if we've done things right or wrong. And so some of my repairs look really ugly, and they look like I've done too much and put strange contraptions in, but there's sometimes a different reason behind them. Even just getting blood samples from an animal can be really, really difficult. So, a rhino may be fine, but it may not be very cooperative, and we can use things like kissing bugs, and we hide them in a little pot where an animal's going to sleep, or in a nest, and it's got a little bit of mesh, and what will happen is they've got an anesthetic in their mouth parts, and they'll bite the animal when it's sleeping, and they'll fill that with blood, and we can actually go and take that little pod, and we can actually take the blood out from them when we're finished. And then some of my cases have had to be very crazy. I've had to smuggle things and take them across the border and run into trouble with the secret police, and there's actually surgery equipment hidden in those bags of rice going into Vietnam, when we had to do some operations on bears and keep people happy. So, in a human theatre, you'd be lucky enough to have everything you want in a big room, and it would all be lovely and clean. And if you need an extra instrument, the nurses can go and fetch it. But for me, often it's what I can put in my suitcase. And so things are often ugly, and I have to be quite careful that I'll take everything in that it's very neat and compact with what I want. And we can still do things very nicely. This is removing an appendix in a orangutan. It actually swallowed a metal nail when a farmer had caught this orangutan raiding the crops and stuck it in a small wooden crate, and it had been trying to escape, and it swallowed a nail. So when it was rescued, it actually got sick, and so we went and took the appendix out, just like they take your appendix out. But sometimes I do wonder, am I doing the right thing, spending the resources that I have to treat one animal, when at the same time this was happening, we had the huge forest fires in Indonesia and terrible smog, and tens of thousands of people probably died from the smoke pollution, and probably thousands of orangutans perished in the forest fires, and I'm operating on one orangutan. It is always really difficult, and I just don't have the skills to go and sort out the bigger problems. I can only do what I can do. But it does sometimes make me wonder if I am doing the right thing treating the individual animals that I do treat. And I don't have an answer for that. There is this bigger picture when we treat individual animals, as I've said, and I can go and patch them up. But the reality is there may be nowhere for these animals to go. You're called out for a rescue and the rainforest is just completely destroyed. And here we're rescuing an orangutan, we'll take it to a center and it'll be quarantined and we'll check it for TB and a bunch of other diseases. And maybe I'll operate on one if it's got a fracture or something. And then what? Because the problem isn't that the orangutans have run into trouble and we're rescuing them and putting them back. The problem is we're destroying the place they need to live. And we don't have a place to put many of these orangutans back. So we have hundreds and hundreds of orangutans in rescue centers and nowhere for them to go. Because if you release them into most areas of forest, there are already orangutans there. And if you release them, all that's going to happen is they're either going to be kicked out to the margins or they're going to kick another orangutan out and it will battle to survive and it will come into conflict with the villagers and it will end up back in the rescue center. So sometimes as vets, there is no solution. And it's really the most important thing that we can do is not the veterinary work, but thinking about how we live our lives, what we consume, how wasteful we are. Do we do things unnecessarily? So we know that if you eat a huge amount of meat, like the typical American, you're eating 4 times as much protein as you need. That makes you unhealthy, but it's also incredibly destructive for the planet. It takes about anywhere between 10 and 20 times as much land to raise the food, to raise the animals that we eat, as it does as if we just ate that food itself. But it isn't completely natural to be vegan. So although I'm vegan, it's only something we can do recently, and that's not maybe necessarily what you need to do. We just maybe need to eat a little bit less, make sure we're not wasteful with what we use, and eat a more balanced diet that's better for our health, and that will be better for the planet. And we need to consume less. So having a new mobile phone every month that your mom and dad gives you a new phone, that's great, and you want the newest gadgets and you want the newest plastic toy, but everything comes from somewhere. And I'm guilty as everyone. I travel a lot internationally and my carbon footprint is bad. So I guess we all have to try and minimize what we can do and be mindful of the things that is difficult for us to change. And there is no solution. We are consumers, so we have to admit that consumers consume the planet, and that's the ugly reality, and we have to be careful. But we also have to be very careful not to say that the problem is too many people, because that's very easy to say, and you'll have a lot of people will say, there's too many poor people in countries having too many babies, and that's why the planet is destroyed. And we have to be very careful, because that can be racist, and that we always want to point the finger at people in other countries. So you may go to Ethiopia and someone may have 10 children, and they're terrible because, we've only got 2 children, and so we're being much more responsible. But the footprint on the planet is 500 times higher for someone in North America than it is for someone in Ethiopia. So no family in Ethiopia has 1,000 children compared to the 2 children a North American family might have. But the impact on the planet is the same. So the problem is not the number of people, it's how we live our lives. And once you realize that the blame lies with each of us as individuals and not with other people. And it's up to us to sort it. Every day, everything you do is a vote for the planet you want. So whether you care and you buy lots of plastic and throw it away, and you throw food in the bin, and you let things expire in the fridge, and you really just don't care about what you do, and you keep changing all the electronics and you don't repair anything, or you live mindfully, there are thousands and thousands, if not millions of people that are the same as you. So whether you do things thoughtfully or poorly, but over a lifetime, it can really make a difference. So it's up to all of us to do that. Anyway, what can we learn from all of this besides there are crazy ways of doing operations and things? I think we can learn that we sometimes, even for me, I can do crazy operations. This is brain surgery in a bear that everyone likes to bring up. How important is it? I don't know. For that bear, it may make its life better, but I'm often working in countries where there's very poor healthcare for people. But I'm a vet. I'm not allowed to treat people, so I'm limited in what I can do. And as I've been honest, perhaps the most important thing that I can do is not the treatment of the individual animals. It is how I live my life. And we know from human healthcare, here's this curve that there is a health gain and there's a cost to it. And this is the same for everything that we do with how we live and we do things in the environment. Is the very fancy stuff we do, fancy operations I do with pandas or design hip replacements, whatever it is that we do, is all at the top. These are very expensive things and they make a small improvement. Whereas, very, very simple treatments for malaria and things like that, both in people and orangutans, cost very little and they give us a lot of health gains. But it's the same with our impact on the planet and how we do things with conservation. We can focus on specific pretty animals, or we can all do a little bit, which actually in the end is what does the most for the planet. It's not a handful of people rushing around operating on orangutans that saves the planet. It's each and every one of us being a little bit more careful what we buy at the supermarket and not being wasteful with how we live our lives. And the analogy I could say is, this is increasingly what I see in the places I travel, is the huge amounts of waste and pollution that we generate as a species. And I do think we're a little bit like these turtles that we will see in how we deal with the planet. If you keep turtles in the water and you give them lots of food, they eat lots of food and they produce a lot of poop. And if you never change the water, they will poison themselves and die. But that water is our planet and we can't change the water. We have the limited resources that we have. And once we consume them, if we destroy the planet, it's gone. There isn't another one. There is no planet B. So that's all a bit, is all a little bit of perspective taking. And it's important for me as well, because I've spent my life doing this work and I have to constantly think about why I do it and what I'm trying to attain, and all the interesting animals I work with. Is it really for a meaningful reason? And I think that doing this kind of work, I really do have to question it. So I don't have answers for a lot of this, but I think these are things that we need to think about. It's not just interesting bits about us enjoying seeing the animals, but being aware that everything we do impacts the planet and the ability for these animals to have something to live. And I really do have to thank my wife, which you saw earlier, who was saying overly kind things about me, because she's pretty crazy to put up with me. When I was going out with my wife and I was doing pathology, I did a post-mortem on an elephant in February, and it was just before Valentine's Day, and I thought, I'm not sure if this is the right person to marry or not. So I sent her this photo of me holding up an elephant's heart for Valentine's Day. Now that's a pretty weird Valentine's Day card, and hopefully no one else has sent one like that. And my wife found it funny, so I married her because I thought that was definitely the right thing to do. And our wedding invitations had these hedgehogs on. And my kids, yes, my daughter's slightly bigger than this. They have, they've put up with me over the years and me disappearing and being a very unreliable dad and husband. And I wouldn't be able to do the things I could. But I do think, we all want to leave a better planet for our children, those of us who have children. We also need to leave better children for our planet. And so some of the things that I've spoken about today are really for the children out there. You probably have more influence on your parents than I do, because I can say this talk and they won't listen to me. But if you go and hound them and tell them not to do things, they will listen to you. I know, because that's what happens with my kids. So I'll stop there, Daniela, because I think I've gone on for ages and I'm getting tired of listening to my own voice. And I think everyone has despaired and gone to watch something much more interesting on Netflix or the BBC or something else.
I'm not tired to hearing your voice. I'm not tired.
So I will come out of that now. That's me, darling.
What a life lesson, this lecture. So I'm again fascinated. I was sure that this talk that you have organized have been amazing and great. So thank you so much. Is the child in the last slide, is your child that is exercising with the
laparoscopic surgery. So there's a story there, because my poor children and my wife are long suffering. So we tried not to cross work. Because oh, sorry, my screen's doing strange things. So I was teaching surgery somewhere and I took the family with us. You shouldn't. And so there was the trainer there. And so my daughter must have been about 5 at the time. I think she hadn't gone to school yet. And so I said, do you want to have a go? It's like a game. And you know what children are. So that's a dirt bin that she's standing on with her pink, sparkly pink sandals. And so she said, yeah, Daddy, I'll have a go. And I remember having to talk to some people, and within 15 minutes, she was better than me. So, I mean, your partner, Paolo, is amazing because he can do all this technical stuff. I must admit, I'm a bit of a moron. I can't figure out my own phone, and I have to give it to my children and say, can you fix it? I don't know how to turn on the TV or make anything work. So they're the clever ones. But I think, yeah, so, you know, we sometimes make things seem more difficult or more complicated than they are. And, you know, you're a surgeon, so actually how to operate is not very difficult. The problem is knowing when to operate. And that's the same thing with my field. The biggest problem with wildlife work is it's not very difficult to take a blood sample from a beaver, or it is difficult in these types of walrus, I would say. But a lot of the things we do are not technically difficult, but we have to be very careful that we're doing them for the right reasons. And sometimes that goes wrong. That happens not just with us, the researchers, TV program makers that make natural history programs. And, you know, if we're not careful, we can actually do more harm than good if we're not really thoughtful about what we do.
Yes, it's the decision-making process, the difficult part. And this is why the training is so long and difficult. It's not learning how to do surgery and when. I don't know how to cut and when to cut.
And more importantly, when not to do anything and say no.
So the Latin people used to say primum non nocere. It means first thing, do not make a harm. Yeah. It's a very important...
it is. Unfortunately, that often doesn't work in the wildlife scheme. I think it is very sad because the animals are very appealing. That sense of perspective is often missing, unfortunately. And so I think people are just driven by the excitement of it's a tiger or it's an elephant, and they don't always remember that that animal is an individual. And, you know, an elephant may live for a very long time. And so you will see quite frequently, you'll see amputee elephants, and they're really, really difficult. And, you know, the problem with, say, an elephant is, say you're a male elephant and you have your leg blown off by a landmine, and people will well-meaningly do, you know, great surgery, and they'll salvage what they can, and you've got a stump and they'll build you a prosthesis. That sounds great, but if you're an animal that can weigh up to 6 tons, you cannot keep that on all the time because you'll get a pressure sore. That's an animal. Also, elephants are very prone to then becoming septic, and they die really quickly. So what happens is you'll have to take that prosthesis on and off. So it'll be a fantastic success, and everyone will be so pleased you're doing good for the animal. It can never go back to the wild. It'll always have to be in care. And now it's a young male. And what's going to happen is it has to have the prosthesis on and off twice a day and rested and a lot of care. But it becomes a teenager. So, you know, after 10, 12 years, it starts to come into must. An Asian elephant in must is a bit crazy. It's basically like a hormonal 14, 15-year-old boy. I mean, they're difficult. It's difficult enough for us to manage, you know, human teenagers. But, you know, several tons of very, very angry elephant, you can't put the prosthesis on and off very well. So invariably what happens is someone gets killed. And then, you know, that person who's looking after an elephant is usually a very skilled person, usually because of their age. They've got a family and responsibilities as well. And then they get killed, and it's all very tragic, but the elephant still needs care. And then people become scared of the elephant, and they don't change the prosthesis as often as they want to, and the elephant gets frustrated. And it usually also ends up with a pressure sore and then becomes septic and it dies. But that can take 20 years to play out, with maybe 1 or 2 human deaths. And so the surgery may take 5 or 6 hours to fix that amputation. And there's a lot of people who genuinely care, who build prosthesis and take after this elephant. But the whole thing is a disaster because the whole big picture has not been thought about, that this is an animal that lives 70 years. And it's very emotional. No one wants to put an elephant down, as you can imagine, when you feel you can do something.
Absolutely. I have a couple of questions. So when you were mentioning about the feeding lions in captivity, you know, that you need to consider what in nature happens. So maybe they eat once every 5-7 days. So is this also true for the little ones, for the it's called the cops. So
I thought you were going to stray into asking me what I feel about raw diets in dogs and cats.
no.
Which I'm happy to give you a very different perspective, and then everyone can send me a rude message after. So I'm not an advocate of raw feeding actually for dogs and cats. I'll answer this first because I've raised this, and there are a couple of reasons. I mean, I think there are a few reasons why, and we as vets, probably most people here will know this, but I'll tell you this from the perspective of someone who deals with wildlife, is getting safe supply of food is very problematic because, feeding deer is expensive. And so we know there's been infectious diseases, and then there's a risk of these are not wolves running around in the countryside, and if they get something, they can deal with it. They're living in your house. So, you're not giving safe food to the animals. Then what will happen is they give your child salmonella and your child ends up in hospital. And so there's these parts that people tend to forget when they feed raw diets. The other thing that I have a problem with, besides the dogs being unnatural, a pug does not look like a wolf and it cannot cope with everything, is that people don't understand risk in a realistic way. So we know the reason that most vets have jobs is because we deal with people's small, hairy children, and they're very risk intolerant. They want us to do everything they can. So, if you're a pack of wolves and one of you swallows a bone and it goes into the intestine and obstructs, you die, that's fine. But the pack structure is fine and the genes are passed on, and that's okay. You wouldn't be very tolerant of saying, well, I'll feed a raw diet to a dog and, there's a chance it might die. Most people, if they understood that, they wouldn't want to do it, and so they get the wrong message from it. So I don't think in the way that we keep animals, a raw diet makes sense for dogs and cats because they are companion animals. However, in the zoo, we are dealing with animals that their physiology and anatomy has not really fundamentally altered almost at all. There are genetic changes because if we breed animals in captivity, they're not undergoing the same selection processes, but they're relatively small. So and there are huge problems that we get when we don't feed whole diets to especially big cats. So we have behavioral problems with them. We have a lot of problems with, say, for example, cheetah. So cheetah get a lot of kidney problems, and they've got problems with how they metabolize protein because people tend to feed them either artificial diets. In the US, they feed them almost like you feed dog and cat type food and minced up sausages and things. And even if we just feed them lots of meat and bone, what will happen is they're getting very unbalanced protein, amino acids, lots of minerals and things are very different, and that's why we get kidney disease and we get gastric problems in cheetahs particularly. And that goes away if you do two things. One is you stop feeding them small bits frequently. They're not a monkey. They're not like us. They're not designed to do that. They don't go out and catch tiny prey all the time. If you watch cheetah, they catch something big and they eat, and that's it. But they also eat lots of parts that we don't tend to give them in captivity. They eat a lot of skin. They eat a lot of hair. They eat parts of the liver. They eat different bits of the viscera, not so much intestinal bits. And if you look at different animals, they'll eat different parts of it. And that's something that is relatively difficult for us to do in rescue centers. In many poor countries, meat is extremely expensive, and so they're being fed a lot of the internal organs that people don't want to eat, or they fed things that are low quality meat, and so it's really difficult in a rescue center in a poor country to replicate what they should actually be eating.
But what I meant is the babies of a lion. They do still feed them with milk frequently, and when they wean them off or when they go to the solid food, is how often are they fed the little ones?
It's to be honest, there's so many species, and although I've helped with hand rearing of lions. I'm the vet. I'm not the person who does hand rearing. I can never remember all these things off the top of my head. So there are pretty good guidelines that we use, but probably more important than that is that we try and get them integrated with other lions, because if you hand rear a lion and it gets really big, it's habituated, and they're a social animal. So it's the same as if you have any social animal like puppies. If you just take puppies and they never see another dog until they're 6 months old, it's a disaster, and they can't have a normal life, and their welfare is really compromised. So we have to, when we're hand rearing lions, the most important thing is we try to get them as soon as we can in contact with other lions. There is a risk, because obviously if you've only got adults in a rescue center and you get some of the centres that I will do a lot of work from a distance and go occasionally once a year. They'll get 2 blind cubs, and the adults killed or the females left them or whatever, and then they have to rear them, and they've got some adult lines in the centre. They'll try and actually keep them in proximity and give them contact through the mesh, because the adult males would just kill them, but and let them grow up and learn some communication. But it is difficult. It's really quite tricky to make that work.
And when I was some years ago, there was a colleague of ours. She was an ophthalmologist that was called to treat cataract in moon bears in Vietnam, China.
Claudia. Claudia,
exactly.
Yeah.
So have you ever been involved in the treatment of the moon bears with the fistulas from the gallbladder? Have you ever treated them or?
Yeah, so my wife has just sent me a message on WhatsApp saying she's okay with bread. I don't have to bring her any when I go home again. I guess that's her joke. So she's actually come to one of my talks, and I probably embarrassed myself more than I should do. But so we did the world's first keyhole cholecystectomies, gallbladder removals in bears in Vietnam. 2009, 2010, something like that. So we wrote it up in the Veterinary Record as a paper. It was actually really difficult to publish, because when we wrote it, people said, "Oh, you should have done CT scans on these bears." But we had to do this very low key. I think the whole trip to do 9 bears, probably we had less funds than it would cost to do 1 laparoscopic chole and a dog. So we had no money and goodwill and a stone, that was a simple stone table. You can't tilt it, you can't do anything with it. We had a welding carbon dioxide, and we had the TV from the local karaoke bar mounted on the wall. That was our screen. And so we did do it. And I guess there's different pathology in different countries. So bears are farmed legally and illegally in different countries. So in China, there's a lot of bear farming. It's legal. So there's still several thousand bears in there, whereas in Vietnam, it's always been illegal. And so it's always been sort of done a bit covertly, in that the bears are kept for tourism or some other purpose. And so the way that they tap them for bile has been different. So in China, they actually insert indwelling catheters, either plastic tubes or metal, whereas in Vietnam, they buy a cheap ultrasound machine and they actually stick a needle across the skin and drain the bile that way, sometimes once or twice a week, actually. And so the pathology they get is very different. So the pathology in the Chinese bears is really quite bad. And I just, with the charities involved there, haven't done a lot. I've mainly been working in Vietnam. And there were many bears having operations that didn't need them. So the feeling was, well, they have pathology, or you couldn't tell on ultrasound, so you opened a bear at X-lap, and then it's a big operation, because bears are very dexterous with their claws. They'll open themselves. So if you can't, you basically end up keeping them in a cage for 4 to 6 weeks afterwards. Just is not great for the bears themselves. So what we really wanted to do is go and see what the pathology is like and make an option. So you didn't just have to open a bear and then end up committing to surgery it maybe didn't need. So the point of that is you can go in, have a quick look, take a liver biopsy, make a judgment, and you could do it or you could leave it. And so when we did pathology, we found that actually pathology wasn't bad. Most of those bears recovered. There was only a handful that ever needed anything done, so it was different to China. So that's really what we did. And so the problem in Vietnam, really, bear farming is almost finished now. It's almost entirely all the bears have nearly all been rescued, so it's not really needed anymore, thankfully.
Paolo says that we have a guest.
Paula hasn't said, "What the hell are you doing? Everyone wants to go to bed." My wife has. She said, been talking for long enough.
I don't know what Paolo is doing behind the scenes, because I was not aware of the surprise. So he says he's a Spanish guest, Spanish colleague. So I would say, Paolo.
Oh dear.
I don't know. Just
remember, this is it. So the one thing I would say is this was really difficult because I'm not sure who I was talking to, Daniela, because I can't tell if I'm speaking mainly to children or I'm speaking mainly to qualified vets.
So
I've kept it very simple because you guys said it's mainly children. Now you're asking me very technical questions. So
I don't know. This is for me.
Sure
It's for my but I have a message here from Luca Ferrazin and Heidi Ferrazin. We had the two questions from Mattia and Dante, and they say that they are all glued to the screen with the children listening to you. So
that's very kind.
Definitely, it's the truth. So, and I will never thank you enough for this. Paolo, what about this guest? So shall we let him in? So I'm not sure who is this. It's Christina.
I want to say a massive thank you. My brain is just so full of things. I will ask you like about 1,000 questions, but I mean, realistically, I just wanted to say a big thank you for getting this together, because it's just been fascinating, absolutely incredible. Just
That's
listening
a polite
to you.
way of saying random, which my wife always says my talks are just a random collection of anecdotes, and she's been pretty honest, and it's right, I'm afraid. So it's just, I'm not sure, I just wasn't sure who I was speaking to. So I think it's either gone too high over kids' heads or too low for vets, but
it was absolutely perfect. And Romain, Christina is a really big supporter of our fundraising campaign. She's so kind that every time she follows a webinar, she makes a donation, and I'm really grateful.
That's why we're all here. So
because it's so thank you, Christina. Thank you, and you on the other side of the camera. So remember why we are here. So I find that the presentation, the talk that Romain did was fantastic. So I really, I was glued to the screen as well, to the videos as well. So please, if you have liked it, or if you will like this presentation,
please donate.
Exactly, give the bloody money.
The whole reason. I mean, it's fascinating, but the whole thing is, obviously we're doing this for a reason that's more important than any of ourselves. So please.
And you can see the link where you can donate. So the link is also always reported below the live events. So because I know it's Sunday night, and
we just need to reiterate the quote from Bob Geldof years ago, which was, "Give us the bloody money."
Yeah. Okay. Maybe. Okay. Give us the bloody money. Sorry about that.
No, that's true. I think that's what it's about. It's fun having a chat. I'm happy to do another chat at some stage, but I think
don't say
that's
twice,
the reason we're here.
You know how I am. If you say this twice, you will.
But the problem is, I don't think Paolo will put up with my chaos anymore. So I'm not the most reliable speaker.
We love you so much, Romain.
No. Thank you for inviting me. It's very kind, and thank you for letting me be part of something so important, because I think, as we said in the talk, we get lost in our own little details, and there's always a bigger picture. And so we're very fortunate as vets, the lives that we're leading and the work. So even when we have a bad day at the moment, we want to strangle someone, or our patients are not cooperating, there are people having a far more difficult time than us. And so thank you for all your hard work, to you and Paolo, for making this all happen. I mean, it's easy for us to just blather on for a bit.
Paolo loves you, Paolo. There is a mistake, a typo. Romain, I think you are pretty tired after the long days at work that you have. So which are the plans? Are you going back to Scotland now, tomorrow, or are you still working in London?
No, so tomorrow I have to speak at a human healthcare conference. What I'm doing is talking about lessons that they can learn for human healthcare from what we call frugal innovation. So a lot of the things, like I've said, is that healthcare gets very stuck on technical details, and everyone gets very excited about the latest bit of robotics or AI, but the majority of the planet don't live in that world and have very, very basic to no healthcare. And so this often gets forgotten. So, I'm giving a talk with someone who invented the iPod, and people who do amazing healthcare stuff. But I guess my talk is is entertainment, because I mean I'm not a fantastic scientist, but it's also just to remind people that there is actually the need for innovation and things at I wouldn't say the bottom end, but actually where most of the world's population lives, with very, very simple improvements in healthcare, can make a huge difference, rather than us focusing just on artificial intelligence and robotics and the cutting edge stuff, where business tends to sort of see the shiny and forget about the rest. So that's tomorrow's job, unfortunately.
Fantastic. Can I say something, Romain? You are so humble, and you do, I don't know if it probably is your nature, but you don't realize how amazing you are, and you just talk like
I'm lucky. You remember, most of life is luck. We'd all like to say it's talent, but I've just been lucky, and because I realize I'm lucky, I see what I do as a privilege. It's not because I have any specific skills or talents. It's really, I've been very lucky with how life has played out for me and the things that I've been able to do. And so it is a privilege. And I think I do take it as a responsibility. I don't always manage to do it well. So I'm sorry if the talk was a bit chaotic, but hopefully at least I've conveyed a bit of that thing. So
I think I should stop to say that the talk was not chaotic. The talk was amazing and super interesting. And I tell you this, most of the time during the live, I just go in the background and I leave the speaker on their own. And this time I've been all the time connected. So this is thank you. And I will, as Christina says, I will also order the book you can.
I don't get any money from it, so I've already been paid, so don't feel compelled to do it. But
I'm doing just because I want
crazy
to.
Stuff. If you like the crazy facts, it's just full of crazy stuff, and it's exactly like I speak. It's all random. So I'm warning you, it's not a very coherent book. It wasn't my idea, but it was enjoyable writing it. So there should be some fascinating bits if you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure. You should write more books. So yeah.
I'm not sure.
You don't have time. You just, maybe when you will retire and your children will take your path, hopefully, so then you can start to write all your books and all your stories.
I think I just need to spend more time playing with my children are getting too big now, but I probably need to pay them more attention.
How old are they now?
So my daughter's 11. She goes to high school now this new year, and my son is 9. So they're a nice age. I mean, they've always been a nice age, so I'm very fortunate. Yeah. I'm very lucky.
Okay, Romain, sorry. I'm
no, don't worry.
Too long.
I think everyone else has left. It's just us having a chat now, but it's good fun.
I'm not quite sure about that, but yes, we have reached the 48 hours of live with you, and 13,196 pounds in donation, which is
that's amazing.
Great.
Well done. Fantastic work, both of you.
And also many greetings from Elisabetta Mancinelli. I think you know her. So she could not take part of the live because she is working. Yes, so I think I'll let you go. So don't forget to donate, please. Donate. And Romain, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I hope to see you again in a way or the other.
I'll get to catch up with you again.
Absolutely. And good night and thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye, everyone. And see you next time. Bye. Thank you, Romain. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, I'm Romain. I'm a zoo and wildlife vet, and I'll be chatting to you about some of the crazy and really interesting things that we can do with wildlife as patients, as veterinarians. But more importantly, I'll be delving into
why we do some of these things and question some of those underlying assumptions about what conservation is and what role we as veterinarians have in it. Sometimes as veterinarians we can get so focused on the technical aspects of what we need to do that we can lose sight of the bigger picture. We really need to think about why we end up doing what it is that we do as veterinarians. Even something as simple as what is actually a wild animal is not an easy question to answer in all cases. If we can't even exactly agree what a wild animal is, then it makes all those questions and difficulties around what is conservation and what should we as veterinarians be doing to aid conservation very difficult to answer. And should we even be focusing on the conservation and preservation of individual animal species when there is so little of our natural world actually left? Would it be better to forget about individual species and just focus on habitat preservation? With so much of the natural world destroyed, where do we draw the line with how we spend our very limited resources? Do we focus on species? Do we focus on subspecies like the Scottish wildcat here? Or do we have to aim for much broader concepts? And what role do zoos play in all of this? Are they truly bastions of conservation? Or are they mainly important for the education of the public to what's going on in the natural world? Or do they have other roles to play?
It's Sunday night and we
just need to reiterate the quote from Bob Geldof years ago, which was, "Give us the bloody money."
Yeah, okay, maybe. Okay, give us the bloody money.